So I'd like to introduce my friend and my colleague, Dr. Eric Schluessel, today. So Dr. Eric Schluessel is a social historian of China and Central Asia. He received his PhD in History and East Asia Languages from Harvard University in 2016. Now he is an assistant professor of History and International Affairs at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., U.S. And his first book, Land of Strangers, the Civilizing Project in Qing, Central Asia, received the John Keane Fairbank Prize for East Asia History in 2021. And I would like to take this opportunity to read the following lines from Adab Khaled on the backside of this book. So I found this very interesting. He said, Schluessel combines prodigious linguistic skills with exhausted archival research and conceptual sophistication to bring the Turfan Oasis to life in all its human complexity. Land of Stranger is a fine, great account of history from below, unlike anything we have on any part of Central Asia, a stellar achievement. So, Dr. Schluessel is also the author of the textbook, An Introduction to Chagatai, and a forthcoming translation of an important chronicle of 19th century Xinjiang, the Tarikh-e-Amidi. Dr. Schluessel has previously held fellowships at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and from the National Endowment of the Humanities. So the topic that he chose for this evening is also very interesting, so please enjoy it. So please, Eric, it's your, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Aisima, for an exceptionally generous introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm really, really pleased to be back here at the State Library of Berlin and to report especially on the findings which I made here last summer from some remarkable new manuscripts which were held in the Stabi's vaults. So, for those of you who aren't yet aware, but I think most of you are, my lecture tonight concerns a particular region of the world. Let's see if the PowerPoint works. Yes, it does. Excellent. The region centered on the Tarim Basin, called Xinjiang or East Turkestan, here in northwestern China. This region is, of course, the homeland of the modern Uyghur people, and has persistently been an object of scholarly interest in Western countries, notably here in Germany, for its perceived position in between the ends of the continent. Many have been attracted to the history of this region as a means to explore trans-Eurasian interconnectivities, the dominant patterns of circulation of people and goods and ideas across the greater continent. Of course, the idea of the Silk Road compelled many archaeologists to come to this region at the turn of the past century in order to look for traces of trade between China and the Mediterranean in the ancient and medieval periods. We know the names of Arl Stein, Albert von Lecoq, and of course the lesser-known figure who's very important to today's talk, Georg Hutt, who died in 1906. Scholarship has tended to focus on the big picture, in which the oases of Xinjiang or East Turkestan are merely way stations. But I'm a social historian. I'm trained in Chinese history and to a relatively proportional degree in Central Asian Islamic manuscripts, and I've always been more curious about what's happening in the region for the people who live there. In this case, for the Uyghur majority. My previous research is focused on the same period I'm talking about tonight, roughly from 1877, when agents of the Qing Empire reconquered the region after a 13-year-long interregnum, up until the 1930s, when the political situation changed radically. This is what many people call the Provincial Period in Xinjiang's history, the period when it was remade from an inner Asian territory ruled separately through its native languages into an integrated part of the central Chinese political and juridical system. So this is the period when an identity based primarily on speaking Turkic and engaging in Islam, gave way to what we think of as an ethno-national identity. So, if we look at the manuscripts in this period, people overwhelmingly called themselves simply Musulmans, meaning Muslims. At the end of this period, however, the term Uyghur became much more prominent, and for that reason, this period has drawn a lot of scholarly attention as well. Part of my intervention so far is to think about how changes in everyday life and social structure led to new tensions, which allowed stronger senses of community to emerge during this period. But there's a part of that story that I've always kind of left unexplored, and actually, I think hardly anyone has looked at this, and that is the deeper economic history of this period, 1877 to the early 1930s. Because the encounter between a new kind of Chinese or Qing power that wanted to remake the people of this region certainly led to new kinds of conflicts and boundaries, but so, I think, did new forms of economic domination by powers who came from outside the region. I make an intervention here similar to what Scott Levi, the historian of Central Asia, has recently tried to do by suggesting that we need to shift our view away from the big Silk Road down towards the kinds of, let's see, how to put it, multi-vectored networks that were firmly situated in Central Asia itself, to look away from the big economic picture and start considering how did ordinary people navigate the great historical shifts of their time. And those shifts were indeed great. Sorry, a little error. Because of the mass violence that covered much of the Qing Empire in the mid-19th century, the region of the Northwest had fallen out of Qing control. And as China historians know, this is a period of great innovation and a time when people tried to save the empire by remaking it culturally and socially from within. During this interregnum, has been argued, we tend to analyze the Muslim uprisings that led to an independent state in the region between 1864 and 1877 in terms of the Great Game, right? Conflict between the Qing, the Russians, and the British Empire, trying to control this region in various ways. This is well documented. But in the spirit of today's talk, I want to focus instead on the kinds of changes that took place very much on the local level. Yaqub Beg, the Hokkandi military officer who seized control of the region during this period, critically, I think, remade the region's agrarian economy. Previously, the Qing had ruled this region through native Turkic-speaking Muslim aristocrats called Begs, and had sustained them through grants of land and serfs, or yenchis, however you want to translate that. But of course, with the uprisings in 1864, they had fallen out of power and out of favor. Yaqub Beg not only dominated the region in a new way, he and his people systematically broke up the old landed estates, as is well documented by Musa Sayrami, the autochthonous historian, and sort of dispossessed the Begs not only politically but also economically. His armies looted much of the region's wealth, and they uprooted entire communities to work as slave labor elsewhere in the region, while ordinary farmers under Yaqub Beg suffered ever heavier tax burdens. Meanwhile, the constant conflicts in this period created a significant population of displaced people who no longer tended to their farms. And so, while the period of Yaqub Beg's rule is often seen in some ways as a moment of East Turkestan's independence, autochthonous chroniclers also show us that it was a moment when the people of the region became somewhat immiserated. When the Xiang army, oh shoot, I'll get there in a second. In 1877, when Yaqub Beg died and the Xiang army entered the region, they calculated that 1/4 to 1/3 of the arable land in Xinjiang had been abandoned or gone fallow, and henceforth engaged in a large-scale resettlement and reclamation effort, which will become very important to our story in a little bit. At the same time, here we are, Yaqub Beg's regime had taken much of that farmland that they had seized from the aristocrats, from the Begs, and reallocated it to Islamic pious endowments, or waqf, plural of Qaf. These are institutions that derive income from rent in order to serve a pious or charitable purpose, such as supporting a mosque, a school, a shrine to an Islamic saint, or a soup kitchen. And they are not allowed to engage in usury, so they can't lend money at interest. According to my calculations, after the end of the Yaqub Beg era, and this is based in part on this really cool source, which was found in a cupboard in Sweden, roughly 10% of all arable land in the region, at least in the area of Kashgar, or possibly more, was held by pious endowments. So we're getting a fairly clear picture of Xinjiang in 1877 as a region where most people were noticeably poorer than those in neighboring lands, as compared for Central Asia, increasing under Russian domination, northern India under the British Empire, or even in China proper, where tremendous wars had caused similar kinds of displacement and poverty, and yet there was still stronger mercantile organizations and a stronger economy overall. It is not surprising that transregional merchant networks moved into Xinjiang in order to dominate this long-distance trade and to extract wealth from its people through money lending and through moving goods around, as these networks had access to credit and capital beyond a Xinjiang person's wildest dreams. So we have pious endowments, which dominate much of the agrarian economy, and then but they're fundamentally local and can't engage in certain kinds of economic activity. But then we have these transregional merchant networks, which can move money around very easily. Indeed, at this point, they've become indispensable to the Qing administration. The reconquest of Xinjiang actually wouldn't have happened without transregional Chinese merchant networks, and for that matter, a certain amount of foreign capital. Oh, there's the Shang army reconquering the region, and various other ones during this period. I think the slide is out of order, and for this I apologize. Now, to give you a glimpse of the kinds of transregional trade we're looking at, here's just an example of how merchants based in Andijan in Central Asia moved wool and cotton out of the region and towards markets to the west. I suspect that around this period we also get milled cotton cloth coming from other directions, from Tianjin, from Manchester, and moving through India and Moscow and China, replacing a lot of the native industry, but I still need to look into that more closely. Networks from Shikarpur in British India widely used money lending to extract wealth from farmers in this region of all ethnicities. This is very well documented in the British India Office archives, where these moneylenders caused great conflict. But I think that we need to spend a little more time looking at the importance of these Chinese merchant networks, such as the great Tongshenghe. There's a slide. The Tongshenghe had grown out of a small group of merchants from the coastal city of Tianjin who had followed the reconquering army and had essentially made themselves the suppliers to the reconquest. And from the 1880s all the way into the 1950s, their familial long-distance networks bound Xinjiang's commerce to China proper in new ways. Consequently, of course, I'm telling the bigger picture here, right? Consequently, previous studies of the East Turkestani economy have overwhelmingly focused on the region as a whole and its relationship with Russian or Soviet or British interests, particularly economic encroachment from the outside. And that's an important part of the story, but I really want to look at those multi-vectored networks that Scott Levi directs us to and see how did regular people in the region respond to these changes. As I've been mentioning, the economy in Xinjiang was and remains overwhelmingly agricultural. And so it's very important that we think first about farmers. This period of the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, and all the way into the 1920s, witnessed the rise of a new kind of system which changed how people related to land and resources. Specifically, the provincial governments under a system similar to the one implemented in the American South after the US Civil War, and actually with similar effects. The government provided silver to these merchant networks. The merchants then lent copper coins, because China had a bimetallic system, silver and copper, lent copper coins to farmers, enabling the farmers to purchase newly opened plots of land. The idea was that farmers would then pay an initial fee to the government for purchasing the land from them, and that thereafter they would provide a percentage of the value of their crop as tax, creating revenue for the government and making it increasingly independent, while they'd be able to pay the merchants back over time. Instead, of course, you might already guess where this story is going. Much of the newly reclaimed land opened up under this system was not actually arable or productive. The architects of this new Xinjiang, this new provincial system, believed essentially that land was infinitely productive as long as you could irrigate it enough. And so they focused strongly on opening irrigation channels and settling people on land. They even believed that farming would help people become better by forming family relationships, and they would transform themselves into good Confucians by engaging in this ideal economic activity. Unfortunately, because the land was largely unworkable in various ways, farmers gained tax exemptions. So they didn't have to pay tax to the government. There was no revenue. Many farmers could then still not grow enough to feed themselves, so they had to move off of the land and become migrant laborers. They became dispossessed from their land. But they still usually owed the money to the merchants. The merchants complained they couldn't pay back their loans to the government, and so the government never got silver back. And essentially, merchants kept collecting copper during this period and amassing the wealth of the region into their own coffers. Also, they lent at extremely high interest rates, and it should not surprise us that by the 1890s, about 1892, murders of merchants and moneylenders became one of the leading causes of violent crime in the region. Not ethnic conflict, but class conflict of a sort, where farmers banded together to find the merchant, slit his throat at night, and run off having freed themselves from this tremendous burden. But it meant that merchant networks, despite that relatively minor danger, did not need to purchase land themselves or collect rent. Instead, they simply captured the agrarian surplus through collecting debt. Let's take a look at the Oasis of Kucha before we look to Turfan, because it illustrates the bigger phenomena I'm talking about here. Aisam is nodding because she knows the story so well. Oh, here's a note from Mulamosa Sairami talking about how the Qing administration measured the land so very, very carefully and surveyed it, and they thought that they were going to give out more to people who had less and less to people who had more. This system functioned in part, as we will see, but it also had perverse effects because the Qing administrators couldn't speak the local language, and basically local institutions were completely opaque to them. So that played out here in the Oasis of Kucha in really specific, interesting ways. See, Kucha, or Kucha in Chinese, had been identified as an underutilized space. Qing administrators believed that only about a third of Kucha was being used, of the arable land, and so they could incentivize others to migrate into this area. Not only Uyghurs, also Hui and Han farmers. There are many instances of forced marriage and resettlement in this area, by the way, early on in the 1870s and 1880s, usually with demobilized soldiers being married to displaced Muslim women. Between 1877 and 1904, through land reclamation, the population of the Oasis roughly tripled or quadrupled. Kucha was not alone. The Oasis of Kashgar and Khotan experienced similar growth for similar reasons. You may have also already guessed that this in-migration put considerable strain on the regional ecology. Now, local elites had been managing Kucha's land and water very carefully for centuries. There are two principal rivers, both of which provide a certain amount of irrigation through specially dug channels. Along these rivers and channels, traditional water managers, Kirk Beshis or blue chiefs, and their leaders, the Mirab, or princes of water in Persian, water princes, carefully managed inter-village and inter-farmer relations in order to ensure that water would always reach the desert. It would reach the end of its necessary channel. Complex arrangements, as in China proper, ensured proper use of water. This new project of building a province and land reclamation took precedence and greatly disrupted those systems that had been in place for so long. A new irrigation channel built in the west, for example, was meant to help supply new land reclamation areas marked in blue on this map. You can kind of see them growing there. This is a Stein's map from 1904. Stein observed these activities pretty carefully. And then down there, near Headman, almost at the place where the river, the Shahiyar River, meets the Tarim River. By 1904, land on the lower reaches of these rivers that had been devoted to farming was no longer workable in the same way because there's not enough water. And so farmers started to transform their farmland into pasture land for sheep and cows and horses. And fled this oasis for oases, places like the Ili Valley, where wages were much, much higher. You can get to the Ili Valley through Yıldız. It's not an easy road, but it's a relatively quick one. So labor migration intensified in this period as people would go over the mountains seasonally to try and find opportunities. Nevertheless, despite the fact that everyone became aware of the destructive effects of this program, the provincial government and local governments continued to use land reclamation and sale as a primary source of revenue into the 1920s, essentially because under the shifting economic situation, constant inflation in China, the instability of currency, and let's not forget the Russian Revolution, which had major impacts on the prices of goods in this region, the provincial government constantly struggled to raise any kind of revenue whatsoever, and land was about the only thing available to them that seemed nearly inexhaustible. You can see why there would be a problem. Now, the settlement wasn't sustainable, but it did lead to an intensification of commercial activity, which we can see, and I'll make the map animate for a second here, with the growth from 4 major marketing centers in the Oasis in 1895 to 9 major marketing centers in the Oasis as of 1904. It seems quite swift. Now, these markets were not open every single day. These were what we would call periodic markets. For the most part, they were open on a given day. So on Monday, you go to one market. The next day, you move on Tuesday to the next. Different goods are sold at each. And there's probably a permanent market. There are 2, I think. There's one in Kucha proper and one there in the west, which were open every day. And these were associated, of course, with larger sacred sites as well. And so it meant you'd buy boots at one place and then, cloth at the next. These markets became associated here and elsewhere in the region with not only specific goods, but the guilds of the craftsmen who made them. Now, this is significant because the marketing system was closely intertwined with the system of Islamic pilgrimage and piety. If you read Ryan Fang's book, Sacred Roots of Uyghur History, he points out how ordinary people, Turkic-speaking Muslims, Uyghur people, built a sense of community and a sense of a link to the past by visiting different sacred sites devoted to certain saints and recalling their stories at those shrines. What I'm finding is that the marketing system tended to form new markets around pre-existing sacred sites, where a given craft guild, which would be organized along the lines of a Sufi lineage, would also be near the shrine to its patron saint, which they could then worship regularly as part of their guild activities. This is interesting in part because the China historians in the room will remember that back in 1964, William Skinner wrote a very influential series of articles called Marketing and Social Structure in Rural China, in which he tried to map out a system of periodic markets and explain how the movement of people and goods on the local level related to social and political mobilizations of different kinds, and indeed how it was intertwined with religion, formal politics, and informal politics, alternative kinds of authority. By understanding how people moved on a periodic basis, a regular basis, having moved across space for these purposes, we can understand how people built their societies and then how they in turn reacted to the changes that came after. Skinner had actually excluded Xinjiang and Tibet from his analysis, claiming that the population density of these regions was too low for them to sustain periodic marketing networks. Wasn't entirely right, as it turns out. And I'm finding these networks in Kucha, Yarkand, Kashgar, Turfan, and many other places where we haven't really thought about local geography and economy much at all, in part because I think we just didn't think as a field to look for these things. And that's why we're doing this kind of basic research now. As the sort of proof, in some ways, of Skinner's hypothesis that religion, politics, and economy all tend to map onto each other, I want to point out that this commercialization of the economy benefited long-distance merchant networks, mostly Chinese, as well as their local allies. Their local allies included Turkic-speaking Muslim people, a man named Abdul Qadir Haji in particular, who's kind of a nefarious figure because he opened up the land at that top blue section over there, which never should have been opened up, and that led to all sorts of ecological problems downriver. But commercialization and merchant networks also threatened the dominance of the pious endowments. So you have the merchants who can engage in money lending, they have credit galore, and then you have the pious endowments, which aren't allowed to lend money, and they have to make their money through rent. The biggest one being the one you see outlined in purple on the top right, the shrine of Arshuddin, an extremely important Islamizing figure, the man who helped convert Tughlaq Timur Khan to Islam centuries before. That family had received a pious endowment of land, outlined in purple here, supposedly 800 years earlier. And now, ecological change was threatening their ability to make money from that land because it was drying up. And they were also realizing that they couldn't compete locally with these merchant networks. And so, in fact, by the 1910s, the managers of this pious endowment did something which certain members of that lineage found very impious. They sold off a certain amount of the land to get capital, and for this they used the Chinese word bangjin to describe what they were doing, to form a merchant network of their own and engage in long-distance trade. They weren't very successful. They did manage to get a British trading license, which exempted them from taxes. That's another story. They ended up in an armed conflict with the merchants, and ended up fleeing all the way across the Kucha Oasis. Their leader was killed in the mountains by a militia organized by the local governments, and history remembers that incident as a religious conflict, an attempt to establish a caliphate or maybe a national liberation movement. But if you look at the records, it's actually dramatizing a conflict brought about by economic change that pitted interest groups against each other. So I think that that's a wonderful sign of how much the commercial economy was affecting the way that people could relate to each other. Okay, I've been telling a big story. Oh, sorry, I'll just go ahead and skip these extra slides. Okay. I have been telling a big story here. It's a story that's borne out in British documents, in Chinese documents, and is confirmed by sources in the Turkic language of Chagatai. This is the ancestor of Uzbek and Uyghur. I probably should have mentioned it earlier. I apologize. But it is the language that most people use to write in this region during this period, and it's the language to which we now turn to gain a new kind of nuanced history from below of economic change in this period. Okay. I'm going to talk about a few really cool, really exciting sources from the Staatsbibliothek zu Berlin, from right here. First, a merchant's notebook, and then a set of ledgers or notebooks, I'm not even sure what word to use for them yet, from the local charitable granary system. They cover different kinds of space, and we'll talk about that in a second, but the cloth merchant records cover the places in the Turfan Oasis, circled in red here. The Turfan Oasis is an important oasis in eastern Xinjiang, which, of course, gained considerable interest for its place in the Silk Road. Then we have granary notebooks, big ones covering the blue area, and then a few related to a specific village in orange, right around the oasis of Karahoja. And Karahoja, that makes sense that these things would come from Karahoja, because that was one of the main sites at which the first Prussian Turfan expedition engaged in archaeological work, where it sought out evidence of pre-Islamic Silk Road contacts in the deserts of Turfan, which used to be a major Buddhist center. One member of that expedition, who I mentioned earlier, was Georg Hutt, who apparently purchased a large sack full of manuscripts, and before his very untimely death in 1906, was not able to fully look through them or catalog them, but his wife provided some of them to the library. I'm now very, very grateful that he did so, because they provide an almost unique look into this level of administration and economic change. So let me get on with the manuscripts. That's what you're here to look at anyway. We begin with documents from a cloth and leather merchant named Tochta Ahund. Unfortunately, Tochta Ahund is basically John Smith, his most common name you can possibly have. But Tochta Ahund was a local cloth and leather merchant with a wide client base. We have one of his account notebooks here in the library, and it tells us a few interesting things. One is that we can see different handwriting from his different clerks. He had the best handwriting, and then we go all the way down to the guy who only scratched things out in pencil. I think it's kind of neat. Looking at these notebooks, we see the changes in the prices of cloth, for example, different kinds. The price of velvet changes. How much was a shirt worth? When people pay him in kind instead of in cash, how much is a loaf of bread worth? And we can begin to see that kind of data over the period of these notebooks, 1894 to 1896, and then match it to archival data from the Turfan archive, which has been published in facsimile. We can start to see how Tochta Ahund moved around the oasis, because we can see the locations where he's meeting with different people. We can also see that people clearly came to him for major orders. We start to see what the market looked like for someone who spoke Turkic natively and was a part of this community. There are some fun surprises in here, because Tochta Ahund engaged with all sorts of artisans, of course. You know, like I said, if a baker came to him, the baker might pay in bread, sometimes in silver or copper, sometimes in bread. If a blacksmith came to him, you might pay him in a nice copper pitcher, or something like that. Some of the most fun stuff, most interesting stuff I found in here concerns the surprising number of women who were engaged in producing crafts for the market. Here we have Harnisa Khan, a very frequent customer, who regularly purchased 1 sun, Chinese vocabulary, so 1 inch of velvet at the price of 8 miskals, that's a unit of silver. Purchased 1, I think, spool of thread. A lot of the vocabulary here is kind of obscure. And a coarse cotton mat, okay, at the price of 1 miskal and 3 thun, written feng in the Chagatai. Some coarse black cotton, some soap, and that was for 1 tenga. So it goes tenga, miskal, or feng. From that, she sewed 6 brocade dopas. A dopa is the traditional Uyghur hat, 4 sides. 3 dopas made of velvet, and 5 more brocade dopas. She regularly sold these dopas, these hats, back to the merchants at fixed prices. So if I recall correctly, it was like 5 tenga for a brocade dopa, 4.5 tenga for a velvet dopa, and like 2.5 tenga for a regular plain dopa. This is pretty interesting. She's far from alone in her engagement with the market. And it was actually Harnisa Khan's husband who was the baker who paid in bread. Sometimes they would pay each other's debts. I've been gradually mapping out the relations I can see in the market in these documents to see who was paying whose debts. And what I think is emerging is a sense of certain families engaged in certain crafts and trades. The next step, once I have some time off, is to go through and try to identify these individuals better and match them to figures who might be mentioned in the archive, so that we can begin to map who might have been particularly wealthy people in this oasis, who was engaged in what kinds of trades. So I'm just checking my timer here and see how I'm doing. Better than I thought it was. Okay. One way of identifying these figures is to go into the other absolutely wonderful selection of documents that Hut brought back from the excavations at Kara Hoca. Okay, these were the ones that Dr. Aysma Sultan, who very kindly introduced me, found in Shtabi a couple of years ago, filed under, I think, Ottoman or something. So they were like in the wrong box, no one had noticed them for a very, very long time. Let us remember the hard work and expertise of librarians and archivists, which is what makes all of this scholarship and history possible. They're interesting in part because when I looked at them, I thought immediately the handwriting is very, very weird. You know, the materials are kind of strange. What's going on here? This handwriting is so peculiar, this Arabo-Persian handwriting, in Chagatai is so peculiar as to be almost illegible, unless you happen to be familiar with the particular way that scribes at the local government in Turfan wrote in Chagatai. In this case, using a Chinese brush that they had received from the Yamen, the local Chinese administrative office, and Chinese ink, often on Chinese paper. And so I thought, this is very curious. Clearly, we have someone who's writing something in Chagatai, I can't quite tell what it is, using what appears to be Chinese stuff. If you look more closely at the top, on the image on the right, we see Aynın Sekizi, so the 8th day of the month. Interesting. There are 10 notebooks, and through many of them we can see dates listed regularly. If we keep looking at the dates, we gradually realize this isn't the Islamic calendar, this is the Chinese lunar calendar, complete with intercalary months. That's interesting. These red circles on the right are very familiar from Chinese accounting practices. They note a closed or finished account. So I asked myself, what the heck am I looking at here? We have lists in Chagatai. Are these taxes owed? Is this more mercantile stuff? No, it doesn't seem to be, because it seems very official. What on earth could we be looking at? Well, lengthy consultation indicated that these come from the charitable granary system, or in Chinese, yicang. Those of you who do Chinese social history may be aware of this. Most people aren't, because it's such a matter of local, deeply local, even sub-local government. But in short, every yamen, every sort of local Chinese administration, had 2 granaries. There was one which was held officially, which was used to gather grain at fixed rates and then put it back in the market in order to provide relief for the poor and stabilize grain prices. Just what we were talking about earlier. Sairami mentions how the Chinese did this. He thought it was so strange and interesting. In these things called cang, Chinese for granary, they kept storing this grain and then distributing it at various intervals. He thought that was really novel and cool. There's a second granary, the charitable granary, which was nominally in the hands of local gentry. So not employees of the yamen, but someone who was trusted by the magistrate and then a series of local notables. These documents indeed come from a system of grain collection and distribution run by Uyghurs themselves in the Turfan Oasis with the collaboration of the yamen in order to balance grain prices and engage in poverty alleviation. So they give us an extremely rare glimpse of how a Qing administration could have worked at the sub-local level. Because this is stuff that I don't even find in the archive from the Turfan Yamen itself. But also, it gives a sense of how people who had been recently reconquered by the Qing and were having very ambiguous feelings about that, and who were actively being put into a program of assimilation by the new governors of this province, might engage with their local government productively or otherwise. So, let's take a little bit of a closer look. Okay, you've seen some of the material aspects of this. Those of you who read Arabo-Persian script may be horrified at this handwriting, but there should be a skip slide. Thank you very much. But you'll see how the brush makes the ink pool in funny places, so it's really hard to make a loop. right? And in places where you want it to be thin and sort of delicate, it gets really fat, or we want it to be fat, it gets really thin, which makes this exceptionally difficult to read. And I hope in the future we'll be able to put out a kind of typeset edition of this, which will help people read and use these documents, because I don't want you to go through what Aisima and I have already gone through. Right, other interesting features from these grain registers include, here we go, let me highlight them. Pseudonumerals. Slide, please. Slide, please. There we are. Perfect. Thank you. Okay. Pseudonumerals. In the bottom left corner, you can see the special numerals used in South China, in particular, and broadly across Chinese accounting, to keep track of numbers. We're not using the typical numerals that people would have used if they were simply scribes writing for Uyghurs by Uyghurs. No, they're using the Chinese system. It looks better with the brush, doesn't it? So they're learning the accounting methods of the Yamen. We also see a lot of Chinese vocabulary. So it's not the 12th lunar month, it's not written on Xinqi Ai, month number 12, it's La Yu, and I puzzled over that for a while. It's La Yue, the 12th month of the lunar calendar. We have measurements being incorporated here as well. Sheng for pint, he for scoop, written in various ways, and da dan, peck, particularly written here da dend, in a way which makes it look like it's Persian. And of course, in this collection system, people will be notified of their presumed obligations to the charitable granary system through a yodan, written yudand, in the documents. The linguistic complexity is pretty interesting. It makes sense because we know that some of the people who were involved in the granary system were themselves, obviously multilingual. There are documents of the Turfan Yamen that are clearly translations of these documents into Chinese, or at least translations of the sum totals into Chinese. And the scribes, whoever was taking these notes, was clearly preparing these documents to be sent to the Yamen for inspection and use by the Chinese-speaking, universally monolingual magistrate. I think there's maybe one magistrate who tried to learn Uyghur. It didn't go particularly well, as far as I'm aware. If we look at, so I think the next slide might be it. No, I'll stay here. Okay. I should also note that these scribes' spelling, from an Islamic perspective, is terrible. Which is interesting. I noticed that, okay, so these documents are written by ear, for the most part. The scribes were not writing everything out in good, perfect Chagatai as you might encounter in a manuscript, or a literary manuscript of the usual kind from Central Asia. Rather, most of the names are written out letter by letter. Some words, like Dokpa, for example, is even written out without the letters joined up in Arabic. They're just going da, ba, ah. So we have people who don't seem to have a full education in Chagatai writing. But they do write the names of the Islamic prophets correctly. Even the ones which are kind of hard to write in Chagatai, because they're not quite phonetic, like Isa, Musa, Muhammad, of course. They get all these perfectly correct, but as soon as they're required to write a name that is beyond that set, they're doing it all phonetically. Yet they seem quite familiar with Chinese terminology. I think, and I think this is Aisima's hypothesis originally, that these notebooks are being written by the Tongshi, the Tongqi, the intermediaries who came from the native population and were educated in Confucian schools with the idea that they'd become good Confucians. And instead, they ended up doing work like this, basic level clerical work that kept them employed at the Yamen. Right. One of the people we do know of who was involved in this system, who I haven't been able to identify, is the headman, Aksakal or Xiangyue, which meant the same thing in Xinjiang. Xiangyue was always a person in Xinjiang. Faizullah, or as is written in the documents, Faizul, or in Chinese, Paizuar, because of course in Uyghur you would pronounce Faizul, Paizul, Paizuar in Chinese. He's kind of a curious figure. He appears here and there, being praised for his ability to speak Chinese. He was involved early on in collecting grain for the charitable granary system, and then rose up the ranks until he was partially in charge of one of these systems in one of the villages. So these are documents from the local Turfan archive that have been very helpful in my research over the past several years. So I think that these are the kinds of people that we're seeing. Okay. Should I put this? Now, as I said, there are two sets of notebooks. One of them has quite a broad-reaching range, marked here in blue. It has donations from Sangim, Pichan, Lanchin, a place called Dehkansu. I'll mention in a minute. I know I'm very short on time, I apologize. And we see the full range of these places covered in these documents. You probably haven't heard of them. Maybe you've heard of Lukchun, which is the seat of a local aristocrat, the Turfan Wang. You've probably heard of Karahoja if you know about the Prussian Turfan expeditions. But the rest of these places are extremely obscure. There are, however, two notebooks that deal with that orange area right around Karahoja, which say something quite different from what we might expect and give us a new level of insight into the village economy. Oh, first I should just mention very quickly, because this is a charitable granary system, it notionally ran on charisma and good feeling. So the idea was that the gentry would want to participate in the system, to do good things with the yamen on behalf of their people. And so you couldn't actually coerce someone into giving money to the charitable granary system, but you could ask politely. So here's Feyzul, or Feyzul again, asking Mullah Mehmet Sayyid very sweetly if he could please fulfill the Yodan, the notice that he was sent, by sending a certain amount of grain. So there are some letters and draft letters stuck here and there in the pages of these notebooks, which speak to the interrelationships between different members of the elites in the Turfan Oasis, how they could ask each other for these favors. Apologies. Here we are. Right. I will note, by the way, that there's a surprising level of transparency and faithfulness in these records. So that good feeling, that request that the locals participate in the system, appears to have produced a system in which the yamen actually knew how much grain was being recorded, was being brought into the system. This is quite surprising because you might expect a certain amount of corruption. Anyone who studies Chinese history should expect a lot of corruption in this period, as people try to make money off of the dying system. But instead, from records like these, or records at the yamen and beyond, we seem to have consistent and even numbers, suggesting that indeed local Uyghur elites found some use in the Qing system, and perhaps its ability to move grain around and its authority to distribute it to the needy. If we go to the village level documents, which are written even rougher, okay, so the yamen only really accounted for relief in terms of wheat and money. And even at the level of the bigger notebooks, everything is written out basically in terms of wheat and money. Volume of wheat, amount of silver and copper. If we look at the village, we actually see that the charitable granaries were engaged in a much broader variety of goods, commodities, and even services. So for example, Shah Musa, there's a record for him at the top, he gave 1.5 scoops of maize to the granary, which was rated at 0.19 silver per scoop. But later he took 6 loaves at 0.13 silver each. He then gave 9 jim, about 2 kilograms of bread, and a certain amount of silver to pay back his debt, but then he took a fund's worth of fodder for his livestock. Then he took some rice and some firewood. There's a lot going on at the village level that the yamen doesn't see. We even see people exchanging a day of irrigation water, for example, or 5 hours of irrigation water for a certain amount of labor. And even, I'm not sure I'm right about this, but I think I'm right about this, hashish. Boxes of tobacco are definitely being exchanged by the charitable granary system at the village level. It appears that narcotics might also have been moved around, perhaps as a means of trading wealth, paying back debts. I'm not sure. So, and this is exactly what Mullah Musa Sairami talks about when he discusses the system, the way that the yamen tracked with local merchants to set prices for things and to ensure that those prices remained stable. To him, this is strange and new. To the Chinese, it was extremely familiar but in between, they came together to provide relief at the local level and give us interesting data on social structure, commercialization of the economy, and price fluctuations. If you think this is all incredibly boring, you're not alone. I think it's important, of course. Boring work is important. We don't do enough of it, especially in the field of Xinjiang history, which is so focused on big political questions, issues of identity that are really, really important, but that neglect important dimensions of everyday life and people's normal experiences. Not everybody has been involved in a national struggle, and not everybody encountered other communities, but they certainly wondered where their next loaf of bread was going to come from. Nevertheless, Sabit Ahud, one of the scribes from the village level, thought this was pretty boring himself. And he wrote right at the end of one of his notebooks, a pickle, another scoop, another scoop, another scoop. Because he's been writing nothing but this for pages and pages and pages and pages, but we're grateful to Sabit Ahud and people like him. Because I think that his work is giving us a means to look at history from below and think about how these grand, tumultuous changes in the Eurasian economy, the reintegration of Xinjiang into the Chinese economy in different ways, into India, into Central Asia, actually affected ordinary life on the ground. So, we'll see where the research goes from here. I'm very grateful to Stabi for having me first last summer with a research grant, and here this summer to give this talk. This is a research I find very exciting, and I hope you find similar. And I very much look forward to questions, comments, and discussion. Thanks again, everyone, for having me.
Thank you very much. So we now have enough time for question and answers, and I want to...
It's fine.
I just want to ask everybody who has a question to just step in front of the microphone and answer that question. Thank you.
Yes, hi.
I was wondering about, you showed at the very beginning one page where the top was kind of structured into a table-like something and the lower part was crossed out, and I was wondering if you could tell what that meant.
Oh, this one here, the list, I think. Or let me see
it's a pretty early thing.
Let's see if we can find the right one. It's a one labeled Akota Shrines Land. It's number 7. It is a ways back.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's fine, don't worry about it. I'll tell you, so this is a really interesting source. I happened to be in Stockholm in May of 2011 when, for the Baptists, someone brought this really interesting document that they found in a cupboard in northern Sweden to the university where there was a, here we are, this one?
No, I think it was even before, it was one of the,
oh.
Because this is a kind of just taking different sections of the text, separate the different sections.
I don't see a document before it, is the issue. If you want, you can come up here and help me find it. Yeah, sure, thank you.
I have a look at this one.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. I apologize for...
No, I'm trying to make this thing move. Yeah. I take yours.
Very much, that's awfully kind. Thank you. Obviously, no.
So everyone else can think about more questions.
I hope so.
Maybe I dreamed of
the talk really is about just moving grain around. If it's not spurring questions, I understand. So that one, yes, okay. So the records of a Turfan cloth and leather merchant, slide number 18. Yes, okay.
or maybe it doesn't mean anything for those people.
So if you're asking about the crossouts,
Yeah, on this kind of.
yeah. So that indicates, as far as I can tell, that the account was settled. Whenever something is crossed out, I've checked the math. It's always a place where someone's debts have now matched the amount that they paid to the merchant. So in the Chinese system, we're using a little circle. Here we're crossing the whole thing.
Yeah, I was especially wondering about this kind of column structure where this would not run with the text
Yeah, okay. It's not much of a column structure, so what I think is happening is, on the first sale or transaction, they had put down the person's name, and then every transaction with them would be followed by another phrase. So actually, this is not very clearly structured data. It's, rather, it's just a series of very short, choppy sentences. So name bought X amount of cloth, X number of yards at whatever rate, stop. X paid 0.8 silver, stop. X paid 1.3 silver, stop. X, etc., etc. It's not very sophisticated.
No, but it's kind of artistic.
I agree. Well, what I think is kind of fun about these documents is with the cartouches and the crosses, you can see a kind of culture of accounting that someone who's better at this stuff really should, than I am, really should look into. Because there are certain ways of writing things, certain ways of phrasing things that seem to be common across the WACF hand list and the Merchant's Notebook and the documents from the Chinese administration. It's worth looking into. There it is, yes.
I just thought about like kind of more visually digesting the content of the page for easier, like the cross out, that's done.
Sorry. I apologize for the pace of my presentation. Are there questions, comments, or verbal abuse? Is there anyone online? How do we look?
No questions online. No questions.
Let's not make something up. Okay, there is a question from Kusna Mulmulata. How do I see the full question? Do I open web apps or what do I do?
Yeah, if the Chinese administration did not understand Chagatai, was there a further translation of the ledgers into Chinese?
Not of the full ledgers, which is interesting, which suggests a certain level of trust. Trust, but maybe just necessity of trusting. The Turkic Muslim underlings at the Yamen. As far as I can tell, the magistrate only saw the final totals from this process. They didn't see how much was collected at the village level or from exactly whom. They knew which sub-village functionary or sub-regional functionary had collected what amount from what general area, and that was it. It's very curious. In an early incident after the establishment of the Reconstruction Administration, one sub-magistrate in Pichan actually killed himself because he found that he was completely incapable of administering anyone in this region because he didn't understand what they were saying. And in relying on his underlings, who some of them could translate for him or interpret, he realized he had no control whatsoever. I think that's actually true of the Xinjiang administration into the 1920s, is that magistrates had very little understanding of what was going on in the places that they were supposedly administrating. Crises only really came to their attention once they got really, really serious. So yeah, there's surprisingly little translation of this kind of quotidian document.
And how long was the system working?
Good question. It was definitely established as soon as the Xian Army entered the region in 1877. One of the first tasks was to establish granaries. It was in place and functioning at least until the end of the Qing. So unlike, for example, the Confucian school system, it was maintained because it was seen as an absolute necessity. After the Xinhai Revolution, I don't know what happens to it. What I've noticed is that a number of the, so basically after 1912, the Xinjiang governments backs off from local society, and it stops funding a lot of the programs that it had used previously to maintain stability of society or to teach, for example, or to survey, and it leaves things up to local actors. So I believe the charitable granary system was actually defunded. But I know that the official schools continued in private hands, so I wouldn't be surprised if these granaries also continued under a local management. If something was unclear, perhaps, maybe that's not why we have questions. You can ask about clarification as well.
I have a question.
Can you step in front of the microphone? Thank you.
The last slide. The last one. The garden, never garden.
Come back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. You said it's from Sabitachen. And the Sabitachen is the host of Gökut at the time in Turfan. What do you think?
He's the what?
The host of German Turfan expedition. What do you think?
You think he
Could
might
it
be?
be possible?
I think that you're the expert on the matter of the details of the Turfan expedition.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be at all surprised if that was the same Sabit Ahmad. I think we have the issue that Sabit Ahmad is a very common name, like Tohta Ahmad, you know. That wouldn't surprise me at all if he decided to make some money by selling off old manuscripts that he no longer had any use for, that the Yamen no longer had any use for.
Yeah.
But I don't know for sure.
Because at the end of this manuscript, the last one in 9th chapter, I think, detailed these booklets are from Sabit Ahmad's den. And I thought maybe it's from this one, from this Sabit Ahmad. I don't know, maybe it's possible.
You're probably right. But I was going to say, you're probably right. Just like Obul Mehdi, there only seems to be one Obul Mehdi in this region, who's active with the expeditions and with his other activities. I guess that the number of literate people in Turfan who could have engaged with the expedition in that way might have been pretty limited.
Yeah, thank you.
I look forward to us finding out.
Okay, we have another question. Do you think that the Turpan granary system was more or less similar in all Xinjiang? Might there have been differences in Jili and Tarim Basin?
It's a very good question. Unfortunately, we only have local archives for Turfan. And these sorts of records are extremely rare even in China proper. So it's difficult to make a proper comparison. Given that this system seems very similar to the one operating in somewhere like Sichuan or Guangdong, I suspect that Kashgar would have operated in basically the same way. There's only a couple of ways we can even begin to speculate on this, because this is not mentioned in travel accounts or anything like that. The Molo, the table of contents of the Kashgar archive, used to be online. I had a look at it, and the contents seem broadly similar. I didn't see whether or not there's a Yitsang operating in Kashgar, but I'm sure that there would have been if it had any similarity to the Turfan administration. I think the question gets in part the issue of how representative is Turfan for the history of Xinjiang in this period, and will remain an open question until the archives in Kashgar, Ili, and Kuchan, places like this, have opened up. But so far, it's been my impression that Turfan, as one of the first oases to be reconquered, was in some ways the first place where the institutions that came to be reproduced across the region were set up. But no, unfortunately, I don't know a certain answer to that. I'm fairly certain that things would have operated similarly elsewhere. I don't know whether or not the people who ran the charitable granary system in a place like Kashgar would have been as honest and transparent as those in Turfan.
Any other questions?
Please.
I'm not sure if I can formulate my question, but in the first section you spoke about money lending, these Shibapuri and Chinese money lenders. And it did not appear in the Turfan section as far as I could notice. And so the main question is, were there money lenders at this village level which you recorded, or didn't they operate there? Because I think there is some basic antagonism between the practices of money lenders or pre-sellers of grain and this idea of charitable granaries.
That's a really interesting point, the basic antagonism. So first of all, I know for certain that Chinese moneylenders were active in this place. Because in 1892, there's a major uprising. Well, there was a sizable uprising that took place right in this area, related to abuses by Chinese moneylenders. An entire Chinese village was burnt on account of it. We know from the Turfan archives that this was the case. I don't necessarily know if the people listed in these documents were the moneylenders themselves. There are Chinese names in here, but mostly they're noted as being a Dungan or a Hui person, a Chinese-speaking Muslim. And I can identify them later on as being part of identifiable Hui communities. So it's interesting, yeah, the moneylenders aren't appearing themselves in these documents necessarily, unless you're taking on assumed names. There is something antithetical between what they're doing and what the government is doing. But what I think the merchants were successful at was presenting themselves as the helpers of the state, as the people who could move grain around effectively. Since the expansion of the Qing population from the 18th century onward, these merchants have been playing that role all across China. Right? They were the ones who moved stuff around for the government. So I would suspect that they tried to play the same role here. It's a good question. I wonder whether or not the charitable granary system's activities actually took profits away from the moneylenders, or if it was the case that the charitable granary system and the poverty that it alleviated was the poverty caused by the moneylenders themselves. I should note, I stupidly skipped this in the talk. The place name mentioned the most in these notebooks is called Dihkan Su. Means farmer water, farmer irrigation channel. And I've never been able to find this place. Every other place name is identifiable. I suspect that Dihkan Su was especially poor because it was a newly opened area for land reclamation. And that's why it needed so much help in this particular period. If that's the case, then we can speculate that the merchants were causing the problem that the granary then had to solve. It's an interesting hypothesis, and I'll have to look into it. Thank you for a stimulating question.